You would think this would be an easy problem to solve. Step 1. Do not pack several thousand tons of high explosives onto a single ship. Step 2. If you do pack several thousand tons of high explosives onto a single ship, do not stack barrels of highly flammable fuel on top of them. Step 3. If you ignore both of those steps, at the very least, do not ram that ship into another vessel inside a crowded civilian harbor at breakfast time. And yet, here we are. December 6, 1917. The First World War is entering its fourth year, and Europe has perfected the art of killing on an industrial scale. Artillery barrages last days, trench systems stretch for miles, chemistry has been weaponized. Logistics, not bravery, decide who lives and who starves. On the other side of the Atlantic, Halifax, Nova Scotia is not supposed to be part of this story. Halifax is a port town. A useful one, yes, but not a battlefield. It smells like coal smoke and salt water, not cordite. It has shopkeepers, dock workers, school children, and a population of roughly 60,000 people who wake up on December 6th expecting nothing more dramatic than winter cold and wartime inconvenience. Unfortunately for Halifax, it is very good at its job. The harbor is deep, naturally sheltered, ice-free all year. It has islands guarding its entrance, and thanks to German U-boats, anti-submarine nets that seal it shut every night like a steel zipper. Convoys assemble here, 20, sometimes 30 ships at a time, before crossing an ocean that has become a hunting ground. Halifax is so useful that it becomes busy. So busy that delays stack up. So busy that patience runs out. And all of this funnels through a single geographical joke known as the Narrows. A channel barely 1,000 feet wide separates Halifax from Dartmouth. It is the maritime equivalent of a hallway where everyone insists they have the right of way. The rules are simple. Stay to starboard, slow down, communicate clearly. The rules are also optional, apparently, because on the morning of December 6th, two ships enter this narrow space with incompatible goals, incompatible attitudes, and a shared belief that the other one will move first. The first is the SS Mont Blanc. She does not look impressive. Built in 1899, slow, worn, and barely capable of 7 knots on a good day. Mont Blanc is a cargo steamer that has already lived too long. When the French government acquires her in 1915, it is not because she is ideal, it is because she floats, which is really the only qualification that matters during a total war. In New York, in early November, Mont Blanc receives her latest assignment. Not food, not coal, explosives, a lot of them. Her holds are rebuilt with wood, cloth, tar, and copper fittings to reduce sparks. Guards are posted. The crew is forbidden from carrying matches. All very understandable precautions when you are loading 62 tons of gun cotton, 250 tons of TNT, and 2,366 tons of picric acid. Altogether, roughly 3 kilotons of explosive power, about 1/5 of Hiroshima, decades before Hiroshima makes that comparison uncomfortable. At this point, Mont Blanc is already the most dangerous object on the Atlantic, but someone notices there is still room, so naturally, they add benzol, hundreds of barrels of a highly flammable fuel product, stacked wherever they fit, secured far less carefully than the explosives beneath them. This is the moment where history pauses, looks directly at the camera, and asks if anyone would like to reconsider. But no one does. Mont Blanc departs unescorted because she is too slow for a convoy. Her crew spends the crossing sleeping badly, feeling every wave like a potential obituary. She arrives off Halifax on December 5th, too late to enter before the submarine nets close. So she waits, anchored outside the harbor, for morning. Inside the harbor, waiting just as impatiently, is the SS Imo. Imo is Norwegian registered, chartered for humanitarian relief. Neutral, clearly marked, not supposed to be shot at. She is faster, larger, and captained by Håkon From, an experienced mariner with a well-documented allergy to delays and a history of explosive temper. Imo is delayed by inspections, delayed by coal, delayed by the harbor prioritizing convoy traffic, cleared to leave, but too late. The nets go up. She must wait. Both ships spend the night annoyed. Morning fixes that. At 7:30 a.m., the nets come down. At 7:50 a.m., Mont Blanc lifts anchor and heads north into the harbor. Emo lifts anchor and heads south. Out. Two ships, one narrow channel, and a city directly in the middle. Everything that follows will be described later as an accident. But what it really is a group project where everyone ignores the instructions. Because before anything explodes, before the fire, before the math turns lethal, the disaster begins the way so many do, with mild irritation, bad habits, and the absolute confidence that someone else will move first. If you wanted to design a perfect maritime failure, you would start with impatience. You would add a narrow channel, wartime congestion, and a set of rules that everyone technically knows, but increasingly treats as guidelines. Then you would introduce two ships whose schedules matter more to them than physics does. Halifax Harbor, in 1917, was exactly that environment. The war had turned the port into a conveyor belt. Convoys assembled in the Bedford Basin, sometimes 20 to 30 ships at a time, waiting for escorts across the Atlantic. Coal trains arrived constantly. Troops moved through by the tens of thousands. The city's population surged past 60,000, swollen by uniforms and urgency. And all of it moved through the Narrows, 1,000 feet wide, Halifax on one side, Dartmouth on the other. A place where ships are supposed to crawl at 5 knots, hug the starboard side, and speak clearly through whistle signals. On the morning of December 6, 1917, the SS Emo did none of those things. Emo was outbound, light and riding high, with her coal finally loaded and her captain eager to leave. Instead of easing into the Narrows, she entered at roughly 7 knots, already pushing the limits before anything went wrong. Something immediately did. Coming toward her was the SS Clara, an American tramp steamer doing its own interpretation of the rules by occupying the wrong side of the channel. Whistles were exchanged, 1 short blast, 2 short blasts, maritime shorthand for please move, and no, you move. Emo compromised, drifting toward the center of the channel. Moments later, she encountered the tug Stella Maris, dragging barges at a pace best described as geological. The tug sat directly in the middle of the Narrows, and once again Emo adjusted, this time farther to port. This is where the situation stops being temporary. By the time Stella Maris passed, Emo was fully committed to the wrong side of the channel, still moving fast, still expecting the world to accommodate her. Up ahead, entering the Narrows from the opposite direction, was the SS Mont Blanc, slow, heavy, and doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Mont Blanc had a harbor pilot aboard, Francis Mackey, a Haligonian with 24 years of experience guiding ships through this water. When Mackey saw Emo bearing down on the wrong side, he did what the rules require. He signaled 1 short blast, a standard request to pass port to port. Emo responded with 2 short blasts. Translation: no. Now both ships were locked into a maritime version of chicken. Mont Blanc slowed and edged closer to the Dartmouth shore, giving Emo space she should not have needed. Emo maintained course, refusing to correct. At this point, everyone on both bridges understood what was happening. This was no longer confusion. This was stubbornness. At the last possible moment, Mont Blanc attempted the only maneuver left. She turned to port, hoping to slip past Emo's bow. And for a brief, tantalizing second, it almost worked. Then someone aboard Emo made the worst possible decision available in that moment. Her engines were thrown into full astern. On a single screw ship, reversing does not stop you neatly. It causes the stern to swing and the bow to pivot. At 8:46 a.m., steel met steel. It was not a dramatic collision. No crashing waves, no screaming metal. Just enough force to tear open Mont Blanc's forward hull. And that was more than enough. Because the bow did not meet explosives, it met benzol barrels. Thin straps snapped, drums ruptured. Highly flammable fuel spilled across decks and poured down into the cargo hold. At this exact moment, Halifax was still completely safe. Nothing had exploded. No one was dead. The city could have gone on with its mourning. All it needed was for no sparks to appear. Unfortunately, Emo was not done helping. A thin plume of black smoke rose from Mont Blanc's bow, and the countdown, finally, began. Because the most dangerous fires are not the loud ones, but the ones that start quietly enough for people to believe they still have time. Fire, unfortunately, does not care about irony, but it does appreciate preparation. and the SS Mont Blanc had been prepared very carefully to ensure that, under absolutely no circumstances, fire would ever touch her cargo. Which is why it only took a few seconds. The benzol spilled freely across the bow, running into corners, seams, and down into the hold. When the sparks came, inevitable, predictable, mundane, the fire did not hesitate. It climbed, it spread, it settled in. A thin column of black smoke rose into the cold December air, understated and almost polite. No explosion, no thunder, just fire. Captain Aimé Lemedec knew the ship's layout. He knew the cruel detail that mattered most. The fire pumps were on the bow, now unreachable. So were the anchors. Every system designed to help them was located precisely where the flames were most intense. Scuttling the ship was discussed only in theory. The Mont Blanc was old. Opening the seacocks would take close to half an hour. Sinking her would take hours. They did not have hours. They had minutes. Heroism, when measured against physics, tends to lose. The order was given. Abandon ship. There was no panic, just urgency. The crew moved aft, where the lifeboats were located, away from the fire. Even then, Lemedec resisted. He argued that a captain does not leave his ship. It took his own crew to convince him that staying would help no one. From shore, the men looked like sailors abandoning a routine harbor fire. Behind them, the Mont Blanc drifted, fully engulfed now, smoke thickening into something impossible to ignore. The current carried her toward the Halifax side of the Narrows, toward Pier 6, toward the most populated edge of the harbor. The city was awake by then. Dock workers were already at their posts. Shops were opening. School children walked toward classrooms, their start times delayed until 9:30 a.m. in winter so boilers could warm the buildings. People stopped, pointed, watched. A burning ship was interesting. A burning ship was not alarming. Even when barrels of benzol began to rupture violently, throwing flaming debris into the air, curiosity outweighed fear. Fire alarms were pulled, telephones rang, fire stations responded, boats moved in close to help. The tug Stella Maris returned again, attempting to attach lines and tow the burning vessel clear. By 9 a.m., the Mont Blanc had grounded beside Pier 6. The pier caught fire, the shore caught fire, smoke darkened the sky, crowds pressed closer. Across the water, the Mont Blanc's crew ran inland, desperate now. One sailor, seeing a woman frozen in place holding her infant, grabbed the child and ran. The woman followed, panic finally breaking paralysis. Both survived. They were the only civilians the crew managed to save. At the Richmond rail yards, dispatcher Patrick Vincent Coleman was finishing his night shift when a sailor burst into the office, shouting that a munitions ship was on fire and about to explode. Then Coleman stopped. A passenger train from St. John, nearly 300 people aboard, was due any moment. Its track ran directly past Pier 6. Coleman turned back. At 9:04 a.m., he sent a final message. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. 35 seconds later, the fire reached 572 degrees Fahrenheit. Picric acid ignited, and the harbor learned, very abruptly, how loud silence can be. At 9:04 and 35 seconds, the problem solved itself. And not in a way anyone could misunderstand afterward. The picric acid reached its ignition point first. It always would have. It is impatient chemistry, far less forgiving than TNT. For a fraction of a second, 1/15 of a second to be precise, the thin steel hull of the SS Mont Blanc contained the detonation. That delay did not save Halifax. It made it worse. When the hull failed, the entire cargo detonated as a single event. Nearly 3 kilotons of explosive force were released at once. Steel vaporized. Water stopped being water. The ship did not explode outward. It ceased to exist. Anyone standing near Pier 6 did not die dramatically. They were simply gone. A literal snap. The blast wave raced outward at roughly 13,000 miles per hour, punching into bedrock and registering on seismographs 250 miles away. In the immediate harbor, pressure reached around 14.7 pounds per square inch, equivalent to what you would experience nearly 2.5 miles under the ocean. Buildings responded poorly. Wooden structures collapsed instantly. Brick walls folded inward. Those watching from windows never heard the blast. They were blinded first. Glass did not shatter outward. It imploded. Thousands of windows collapsed inward simultaneously, firing shards into faces, eyes, and throats. Later counts would show thousands of eye injuries, a grotesque signature of the disaster that would follow survivors for the rest of their lives. Then the harbor itself reacted. The explosion vaporized enormous volumes of water, leaving a temporary void that collapsed violently. The result was a tsunami, accounts vary between 20 and 60 feet high, that surged outward from the blast site. The SS Emo, which had helpfully initiated the collision, was lifted by the wave and thrown onto the Dartmouth shore. Nearly everyone aboard was killed. A mushroom cloud climbed into the sky, thick with smoke, debris, and unburnt benzol. Oily residue fell back onto the city like black rain, igniting secondary fires wherever it landed. And then, briefly, there was quiet. Not peace, just the absence of sound after something too loud to process. Confusion followed close behind. Because it was wartime, many assumed Halifax had been attacked. Soldiers ran to defensive positions. Others fled, convinced another explosion was imminent. Rescue efforts stalled repeatedly as rumors outran facts. At the Wellington barracks, hot embers rained dangerously close to a fully stocked ammunition magazine. A young lieutenant, C.A. McClellan, grabbed a fire extinguisher and smothered them in time, likely preventing a second catastrophe. This pattern would repeat all day. Fear interrupting help, help resuming anyway. By the end of the morning, roughly 1,600 people were dead. In the days that followed, the number would rise toward 2,000. More than 9,000 were injured. About 25,000 people, nearly half the city, were suddenly homeless. And then, because the universe has a sense of timing, winter arrived. The next day, a blizzard buried Halifax under more than a foot of snow, freezing the wounded, trapping the buried, and slowing rescue efforts to a crawl. Trains carrying medical supplies stalled in whiteout conditions just miles away. Still, people came. Sailors from nearby ships ran ashore. American and British warships that had felt the blast more than 50 miles away diverted to help. Under the ruins of Richmond Station, Patrick Vincent Coleman was found. His pocket watch had stopped. The hands were gone. The train he stopped never arrived. Which is how, in the middle of the largest non-nuclear explosion the world had ever seen, one small system worked exactly once. Because once the fires cooled and the dead were counted, Halifax faced the more uncomfortable problem, deciding who exactly was supposed to be responsible for doing all of this. Once the fires burned down and the bodies were counted, Halifax did what every shattered system does next. It looked for a person to hold still. Grief demands shape. Anger wants a name. And in a city where nearly 2,000 people were dead, 9,000 injured, and 25,000 homeless, patience for nuance evaporated quickly. An inquiry was inevitable. The Wreck Commissioner's inquiry convened while the city was still digging itself out from under snow and splintered timber. Its task, at least on paper, was simple: determine responsibility for the collision and the explosion that followed. In practice, the conclusion arrived almost immediately. The SS Mont Blanc was blamed. The logic was emotionally efficient. Mont Blanc carried the explosives. Therefore, Mont Blanc was at fault. It was a conclusion that required no uncomfortable examination of harbor congestion, pilot signaling, speed limits. Captain Aimé Lemedec, harbor pilot Francis Mackey. The accusation rested on the idea that a ship carrying such a dangerous cargo had an absolute responsibility to avoid collision, regardless of what anyone else did. This argument had a certain emotional appeal, particularly given one inconvenient detail. The crew of the SS Emo, whose captain had sped through the Narrows, ignored signals, and reversed engines at the worst possible moment, was almost entirely dead. Public anger does not like empty targets. Mont Blanc's crew, by contrast, had survived. They had escaped. They had been seen rowing away while the city burned. To many observers, this looked less like survival and more like abandonment. The charges, however, did not last. There simply was not enough evidence to bring the men to trial. The rules of navigation had been broken by both ships. Testimony conflicted. Harbor procedures themselves were inconsistent under wartime strain. Eventually, the manslaughter charges were dropped. The legal story did not end there. In 1919, the case reached the Supreme Court of Canada and then the Privy Council in London. The higher courts reversed the earlier finding. Their conclusion was far less satisfying, but considerably more accurate. The disaster had been the result of shared fault. Both ships had violated navigation rules. Both captains had made poor decisions. The harbor system itself had failed under pressure. No single villain emerged. No neat moral lesson survived intact. By then, Halifax had already moved on to the next problem: rebuilding. The scale of destruction forced new thinking. Entire neighborhoods were redesigned. One of Canada's first major public housing projects, the Hydrostone District, rose from the ruins, its stone construction chosen specifically to resist fire and blast. Many of those buildings still stand, quietly advertising what happens when architecture learns the hard way. Some changes were less visible but far more lasting. The explosion produced an unprecedented number of eye injuries, thousands of them, many permanent. Existing charities were overwhelmed. Out of necessity, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind was created, an organization that still exists today because of flying glass in 1917. To manage compensation, housing, and long-term care, the Halifax Relief Commission was established. It did not quietly dissolve after a few years. It operated until 1976, still paying pensions to the injured and the families of the dead, nearly 60 years after the explosion itself. And help came from outside. Boston responded almost immediately, sending doctors, nurses, and supplies that arrived just as the blizzard made conditions worse. The aid saved lives. It also created a tradition. Every year since, Nova Scotia sends Boston a Christmas tree, a gesture of gratitude that began as a thank you for showing up when everything else had failed. Halifax rebuilt. The harbor returned to work. The world found larger explosions to worry about, but the uncomfortable truth remained. Nothing about December 6th required malice, only haste, confidence, and the assumption that rules are for other people. Because the final legacy of Halifax is not the explosion itself, but the fact that in the middle of all this, once, one person chose not to follow the rules of self-preservation. After everything, after the physics, the committees, the court rulings, the memorials, Halifax still refuses to be a story about systems. It insists on being a story about a single interruption. Patrick Vincent Coleman was not important in the way disasters usually define importance. He commanded nothing. He carried no authority beyond a desk, a timetable, and a telegraph key. His job was to keep trains moving on schedule, not to stop them. On the morning of December 6, 1917, he was finishing his night shift at Richmond Station, a modest rail yard positioned inconveniently close to Pier 6. From his office, the harbor was visible. Smoke was visible. The sense that something had gone badly wrong did not require imagination. A sailor arrived out of breath, shouting fragments of a sentence that barely needed grammar to be understood. A French munitions ship was on fire, adrift, abandoned, and about to explode. Coleman did what everyone else did first. He ran. And then, unlike almost everyone else that morning, he stopped running. Because Coleman knew something that mattered. The overnight passenger train from St. John was due any moment. Nearly 300 people were aboard. The track ran directly past Pier 6. If the train arrived on time, it would enter the blast zone exactly when the Mont Blanc finished burning. There was no policy for this, no checklist, no superior officer to consult, just a man with enough understanding of the system to realize that, for once, following the schedule would kill everyone. So Coleman turned around. He went back into the telegraph office, sat down, and sent a message that is still uncomfortable to read because of how calm it is. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. It was sent at 9:04 a.m. 35 seconds later, the harbor erased itself. Coleman did not survive, of course. The explosion tore Richmond Station apart. When his body was recovered, his pocket watch had stopped, its hands blown away by the shock wave. Death would have been instantaneous. The train, however, did exactly what it was told. It stopped. And because it stopped, hundreds of people who would never know Coleman's name lived out ordinary lives instead of becoming a footnote in a casualty report. The warning also spread down the telegraph network, halting other inbound trains and triggering early relief responses that would matter hours later. Coleman did not save Halifax. No one could have. What he did was smaller, quieter, and infinitely rarer. He broke a chain of events that could have become much worse. The Halifax explosion remained the largest non-nuclear man-made explosion in history until 1945, when humanity demonstrated that it could, in fact, do much worse, on purpose this time. Halifax, by contrast, achieved its destruction through routine behavior, mild impatience, and the firm belief that nothing truly catastrophic ever happens during a normal workday. The city rebuilt, the harbor stayed busy, the narrows remained narrow, ships continued to pass each other with whistles and assumptions, but Halifax never really escaped December 6th. It lives on in rebuilt neighborhoods, in changed safety laws, in an institute for the blind that exists because windows once became weapons. It lives on in an annual Christmas tree sent to Boston, a tradition born from the simple act of showing up when nothing else worked. And it lives on in the most irritating lesson of all. The disaster was 100% avoidable. It was not mysterious, didn't involve any evil spirit. It just needed that almost everyone involved behave exactly the way they usually did, except for one man who didn't.